Tell me about a time you took ownership of a project. This is a common behavioral interview question for software developers, backend developers, full-stack developers, senior developers, and team leads. Interviewers ask this question to understand whether you take responsibility beyond assigned coding tasks, how you manage delivery from start to finish, how you coordinate with product owners, QA, developers, and stakeholders, how you identify and communicate risks, how you handle blockers, how you ensure quality before release, how you support the project after delivery. This question is especially important for Java developers, backend developers, Spring Boot developers, full-stack developers, senior software developers, team leads, Agile teams, product-focused teams. The best way to answer this question is by using the STAR method. STAR means S, situation, explain the background. T, task, explain your responsibility. A, action, explain what you personally did. R, result, explain the final outcome. A good interview answer usually spends 10% situation, 10% task, 60% action, 20% result. The most important part is the action section, because interviewers want to understand how you took initiative, coordinated the work, solved problems, and delivered the project successfully. Question: tell me about a time you took ownership of a project. Example 1. Taking ownership of a new Spring Boot API situation. In one project, our team needed to build a new customer search API using Spring Boot. The API had to support filters, pagination, sorting, validation, role-based access, and error handling. The requirement was important because multiple teams needed the API for front-end integration and reporting workflows. Task: I took ownership of the back-end API delivery, from requirement clarification to implementation, testing, and release support. Action: I started by reviewing the user story and identifying unclear areas. I worked with the product owner and QA to clarify searchable fields, required filters, optional filters, pagination behavior, sorting behavior, empty result behavior, validation messages, authorization rules, error response format. Then, I designed the API contract. I defined RU, endpoint URL, request parameters, response DTO, HTTP status codes, validation rules, security rules, sample request and response JSON. I also coordinated with the front-end developer so they could start integration early. During development, I implemented controller layer, service layer, repository query, DTO mapping, validation logic, pagination, sorting, role-based authorization, unit tests, integration tests. I communicated progress during stand-ups and raised risks early. When QA found an issue with invalid sorting, I reproduced it locally, fixed it, and added a regression test. I also updated API documentation so future developers and QA could understand the behavior. Result: the API was delivered within the sprint. Front-end integration was smoother because the contract was clear. QA testing had fewer surprises, and the product owner accepted the feature. The project showed that I could own a feature end-to-end, not just write code. Why this answer works? This answer is strong because it shows end-to-end ownership, requirement clarification, API design, Spring Boot implementation, QA and front-end coordination, testing and documentation. Example 2. Taking ownership of a production issue situation. In one application, users reported incorrect report totals for certain date ranges. The issue affected business reporting accuracy, so it needed quick investigation and resolution. Task: I took ownership of investigating the issue, coordinating with QA and business users, fixing the root cause, and preventing recurrence. Action: I first gathered details from the issue report. I reviewed affected date ranges, expected report totals, actual report totals, API response, database records, logs, recent code changes. I worked with QA and the business team to understand the expected calculation. We found that records near midnight were being counted incorrectly because of time zone handling. I explained the issue to stakeholders in simple terms. The backend was using one date interpretation, while the business expected totals based on the business time zone. Then I fixed the calculation logic. I added regression tests for records near midnight, month-end records, inclusive end dates, daylight saving time scenarios, empty result scenarios. I also reviewed similar reports to check whether the same assumption existed elsewhere. After the fix, I supported QA verification and communicated the final status to the product owner. Result: the report totals became accurate. The issue was fixed before it caused wider business impact. The regression tests reduced the chance of the same issue happening again. Why this answer works? This answer is good because it shows C. Production ownership, root cause analysis, stakeholder communication, business impact awareness, regression testing, prevention mindset. Example 3. Taking ownership of a Kafka consumer feature situation. In one microservices project, our service needed to consume customer update events from Kafka. The consumer had to handle valid messages, duplicate messages, invalid payloads, downstream failures, retries, and dead letter queue scenarios. Task: I took ownership of designing and implementing the Kafka consumer reliably. Action: I started by reviewing the event contract and business requirement. I clarified. Check topic name, event schema, required fields, optional fields, unique event ID, retry behavior, duplicate message handling, dead letter queue behavior, logging requirements, monitoring needs. Then I designed the consumer flow. The flow included: check read event, check validate payload, check item potency, check process business logic, check update database, retry temporary failures, send permanent failures to DLQ, log correlation ID, expose monitoring metrics. I worked with QA to define test scenarios. The scenarios included successful event processing, duplicate event, invalid payload, missing required field, downstream timeout, retry success, permanent failure, DLQ routing. I also documented the consumer behavior so support teams could troubleshoot failures. Result: the Kafka consumer was delivered successfully. It handled duplicate events and failures safely. QA had clear test coverage, and support teams had documentation for production troubleshooting. Why this answer works? This answer is strong because it shows event-driven ownership, Kafka knowledge, idempotency, retry, and DLQ handling, QA collaboration, operational readiness. Example 4. Taking ownership of a refactoring project situation. In one Spring Boot application, a large service class had grown difficult to maintain. It contained validation, business logic, mapping, database access, and external API calls in one place. The code still worked, but every change became risky. Task: I took ownership of refactoring the service safely without changing existing behavior. Action: I first reviewed the existing code and identified responsibilities that could be separated. The responsibilities included check validation, business orchestration, DTO mapping, repository access, external service call, error handling, logging. Before refactoring, I checked existing test coverage. Where coverage was missing, I added tests first to protect behavior. Then, I refactored incrementally. I moved mapping logic into a mapper, mapping validation logic into a validator, external calls into a client class, business orchestration into a cleaner service method. After each step, I ran unit and integration tests. I also asked another senior developer to review the design before merging. I documented the new structure so future developers could follow the pattern. Result: the service class became smaller and easier to understand. Future changes became safer and faster. The refactor reduced technical debt and improved maintainability. Why this answer works. This answer is good because it shows technical ownership, safe refactoring, test-first thinking, maintainability improvement, collaboration, long-term quality focus. Example 5. Taking ownership of a release situation. In one project, we were preparing to release a feature that included backend API changes, front-end integration, database updates, and QA regression testing. There were multiple moving parts, and the team needed clear coordination. Task. I took ownership of coordinating the technical release readiness for the feature. Action. I created a release checklist. The checklist included code merged, pull requests approved, database script reviewed, environment variables confirmed, QA testing completed, regression testing completed, smoke test scenarios prepared, rollback steps documented, monitoring dashboard checked, deployment notes shared. I coordinated with developers, QA, product owner, DevOps, release team. I also communicated risks early. One risk was that the feature touched shared validation logic used by older APIs. I worked with QA to create focused regression tests for those affected flows. Before deployment, I confirmed that rollback steps and smoke tests were ready. After deployment, I monitored logs, API response times, and error rates. Result. The release went smoothly. There were no major production issues. The checklist became a reusable reference for future releases. Why this answer works. This answer is strong because it shows release ownership, coordination, risk management, QA and DevOps collaboration, rollback planning, production readiness. Example 6. Taking ownership of technical documentation situation. In one project, new developers and QA engineers often asked repeated questions about how a service worked. The service had multiple APIs, Kafka integration, environment variables, and troubleshooting steps, but documentation was incomplete. I took ownership of creating useful technical documentation for the service. Action. I started by identifying the audience. Developers needed setup and architecture details. QA needed API behavior and test scenarios. Support teams needed troubleshooting steps. I documented COC, service overview, local setup steps, required Java and Maven versions, environment variables, API endpoints, request and response examples, validation rules, error responses, Kafka topics, retry and DLQ behavior, database tables, monitoring dashboards, common issues and fixes. I also added diagrams for request flow and event processing. I asked a new team member to follow the setup guide and updated unclear steps based on their feedback. I added ownership and a review date so the documentation would stay current. Result. Onboarding became faster. QA and support teams had fewer repeated questions. The documentation improved knowledge sharing and reduced dependency on individual developers. Why this answer works. This answer is good because it shows check, documentation ownership, audience awareness, onboarding improvement, QA and support alignment, maintainability, team productivity. Example 7. Taking ownership of a data migration situation. In one release, our team needed to migrate customer records from an old data model to a new one. The migration had risk because some old records had missing fields, duplicate values, and unclear status mappings. Task. I took ownership of the migration planning, validation, execution support, and stakeholder communication. Action. I started by analyzing the old data. I identified risky cases such as key missing required fields, key duplicate identifiers, key old status values, key inactive customers, key invalid dates, records needing manual review. Then I created a migration plan. The plan included mapping document, validation rules, skipped record report, test migration, record count validation, rollback plan, production migration checklist. I reviewed unclear mappings with the business team. I worked with QA to define validation checks after migration. During test migration, we found records that needed correction. I shared an error report with the business team and helped confirm how those records should be handled. Result: the production migration completed successfully. Invalid records were handled safely instead of being migrated silently. The business team trusted the migration because they were involved in validating the rules. Why this answer works? This answer is strong because it shows C. Data ownership, C. Migration planning, C. Business collaboration, C. Validation, C. Rollback thinking, C. Data quality protection. Example 8. Taking ownership of an MVP feature situation. In one project, the business wanted a dashboard with summary cards, filters, export functionality, and drill-down pages. The deadline was tight, and the original scope was too large for one sprint. Task: I took ownership of helping the team define a realistic MVP and deliver the highest value functionality first. Action: I reviewed the requested features and grouped them by priority. The groups were: class, must-have for first release, useful but not required immediately; class, future enhancement; class, unclear requirement; class, high-risk item. I worked with the product owner to clarify what users needed for the first usable version. We agreed that the MVP would include summary cards, basic filters, role-based visibility, backend API, validation, QA-tested core flow. Future phases would include export functionality, advanced filters, drill-down views, additional charts. I helped break the work into smaller stories. I also coordinated with QA and front-end developers so everyone understood the first release scope. During development, I tracked blockers, communicated progress, and made sure the acceptance criteria stayed aligned with the MVP. Result: the MVP was delivered on time. The business got a usable first version without waiting for every enhancement. The remaining features were planned clearly for later sprints. Why this answer works? This answer is good because it shows product ownership mindset, MVP planning, scope management, stakeholder alignment, agile delivery, practical leadership. Best short answer version. If you need a short interview answer, you can say, in one project, I took ownership of delivering a new Spring Boot customer search API. The API needed to support filters, pagination, sorting, validation, authorization, and error handling. I started by clarifying the requirements with the product owner and QA, including searchable fields, empty result behavior, pagination rules, sorting, validation messages, and access rules. Then I designed the API contract with request parameters, response DTOs, HTTP status codes, and sample JSON responses. During development, I implemented the controller, service layer, repository query, validation, pagination, sorting, authorization, unit tests, and integration tests. I also coordinated with the front-end developer by sharing sample responses early. When QA found an invalid sorting issue, I reproduced it, fixed it, and added a regression test. As a result, the API was delivered within the sprint. Front-end integration was smoother. QA testing had fewer surprises, and the product owner accepted the feature. Common mistakes to avoid. 1. Saying only, I completed my task. Bad answer. I owned the project by finishing my coding work. Better answer. I clarified requirements, coordinated with QA and front-end, managed risks, implemented the solution, tested it, documented it, and supported release. 2. Taking credit for everyone's work. Bad answer. I delivered the whole project myself. Better answer. I took ownership of my area while coordinating with the team and making sure dependencies were clear. 3. No evidence of ownership. Bad answer. I was assigned the project and worked on it. Better answer. I proactively identified unclear requirements, raised risks, created a plan, and followed through until release. 4. Ignoring communication. Bad answer. I focused on coding and finished it. Better answer. I gave regular updates, raised blockers early, aligned with stakeholders, and helped QA and front-end teams. 5. No result. Bad answer. The project was completed. Better answer. The feature was delivered on time. QA testing was smoother, and the documentation helped future maintenance. Best practices for answering this question. Use the STAR method. Choose a project where you had real responsibility. Explain what you owned. Show initiative. Mention planning and clarification. Mention communication. Mention risk management. Mention testing and quality. Mention documentation or release support. End with a measurable result. What interviewers are looking for. Interviewers want to see whether you can. Check. Take responsibility. Drive work independently. Communicate with stakeholders. Coordinate with cross-functional teams. Handle blockers. Make decisions. Deliver quality work. Follow through after implementation. Think beyond your assigned ticket. For senior roles, they also want to see CAPS, technical leadership, project coordination, risk ownership, stakeholder management, mentoring or team support, release readiness judgment, long-term maintainability thinking. Strong words to use in your answer. You can use words like owned, drove, coordinated, clarified, planned, implemented, communicated, tracked risks, removed blockers, aligned stakeholders, validated, documented, supported release, followed through. Example: I took ownership by clarifying the requirements, designing the API contract, coordinating with front-end and QA, communicating risks early, implementing the backend changes, adding tests, documenting the behavior, and supporting the release. Good ownership topics you can use. Depending on your experience, you can talk about check, Spring Boot API delivery, production issue resolution, Kafka consumer implementation, refactoring project, release coordination, technical documentation, data migration, MVP feature delivery, performance improvement project, security feature implementation, monitoring and alerting improvement, onboarding, guide creation, batch job improvement, front-end, back-end, integration, database migration planning. Final summary. Tell me about a time you took ownership of a project is an important interview question because companies want developers who do more than wait for instructions. The best answer should include X, what project you owned, why ownership was needed, your responsibility, how you clarified requirements, how you planned the work, how you coordinated with others, how you handled risks or blockers, how you ensured quality, what result improved. Good examples include owning a Spring Boot API, resolving a production issue, implementing a Kafka consumer, refactoring a service, coordinating a release, writing documentation, managing a data migration, delivering an MVP feature. The strongest answers show initiative, accountability, communication, technical judgment, delivery focus, and follow-through.